Welcome to a Town Hall Special Edition, a social justice crisis in America. I'm Alex Lakowski, Executive Director of Media Relations. Thank you for making time for this important discussion. Your participation this morning is crucial, so first, let me explain how to connect with the panel. Please use the chat function to send your questions or comments to the hosts and panelists. Look for the button at the bottom of the screen that looks like a speech bubble. If you're using a cell phone, the icon is on the upper right-hand area of the screen. Type your question there, and when the time comes, the hosts will call on you by name. When they do that, I will unmute your mic so you don't have to do anything but speak up and be heard. Now, if your question is sensitive and you want to remain anonymous, that's okay too. Just let us know and someone will read your question for you. One more thing, today's program is being recorded and will be available soon on the University of Maryland Baltimore homepage, umaryland.edu. So with all of the nuts and bolts out of the way, please welcome Interim President Dr. Bruce Jarrell.
Us have seen the events that occurred with Mr. George Floyd last week. Like I suspect most of you, I was horrified at these events. Many thoughts flashed before my mind. I had grief for Mr. Floyd and his family. I had sadness for our country. This was an example of brutality that could not be denied. It was right there out in front of us before our very eyes. Facts were clear. The thoughts that went through my mind when I saw this was, could that have been me on the ground? Yes, that thought did occur to me. And I think many of you would agree that the answer is probably not. Could it have been someone who I was a friend with or acquaintance with? Yes, maybe so. A friend of mine with color? Yes, maybe so. But that's part of the issue, isn't it? And that's part of why we're here. Could it have been someone in my family or friends? Perhaps. Could it have been me standing over Mr. Floyd or someone like me? Personally, I would hope not. It would violate every fiber in my body. Could that event have occurred at UMB? I hope not. I have great confidence in our police force, and I believe that Chief Carey and her force have been very focused on these issues. But how could we, all of us, accept this as an acceptable kind of behavior? It is not. It is a pattern. It is a clear pattern of structural oppression. I agree with that. How could I accept that it was okay for any of us to stand by and watch this occur? There were bystanders, there were other officers, and there were all of us who stood by and watched this occur. I could not accept that as acceptable. But what could I do? That's a rhetorical question. I'll answer it later, but I think the thought that I had was, but what could I do? And I hope to hear some answer to that. Now, some of you know that I have a previous life as a transplant surgeon. Surgeons solve many medical problems. They fix infections, they stop bleeding, they remove tumors, and in my case, they put in new kidneys and livers. As a surgeon, I know exactly what to do when a patient is bleeding. I stop the bleeding, and I have many tools at my fingertips. Surgeons are very good at stopping bleeding. Surgeons are also very good at figuring out why the bleeding actually occurred. Was it a damaged blood vessel or a tumor or some disease process? If I understand the problem, I can put it right and I can hopefully prevent it from ever occurring again. So what do surgeons do when they do not know how to solve a particular problem? I can tell you what I did. I would put my pride aside. I would admit that I did not know something and I would ask for help. I would consult with other experts who have experience or research findings to guide me. I would read about experts' opinions. I would incorporate their knowledge into my thinking and practice, one patient at a time. It becomes part of your nature. And so it is clear that there is bleeding from the events that we have seen witnessed with Mr. George Floyd. A person has died, and he is one of many that precede him. Now, I am not expert in why this is occurring. And although I and the senior leaders around me have learned about topics such as structural oppression and many related topics, especially in Baltimore, I do not have answers. So I have turned to the experts at UMB who can help me to understand this better. how to figure out to make UMB and its community, including its students, not only more insensitive and more informed on these issues, but also to help develop a plan to take action. To that end, I have asked Dr. Elsie Stines, chair of the University of Maryland, Baltimore's Diversity Advisory Council, the DAC, and Professor Russell McClain from the Carey School of Law and a member of the DAC to lead a discussion on this topic. I hope that our community can get some of its emotions, grief, and rage expressed, but then help us begin to move forward UMB, because after all, we're about improving the human condition. That is our fundamental mission. And I hope to hear some answers to my rhetorical question posed earlier. But what could I do? Dr. Steins, Professor McClain, I hand it to you.
Thank you, Dr. Jarrell. Good morning and welcome. First, I want to take a moment of silence to honor the life of George Floyd. We will be silent for 1 minute, recognizing that the police officer had his knee on Mr. Floyd's neck for an additional 8 minutes. We know you are here for different reasons: to learn, share, process, and connect, and to propose ideas moving forward. In this town hall, we hope to give space, a brave space, for all of this. Having conversations about racism can be uncomfortable. That is entirely okay. Before we get started, let's just take a moment to be present with what is here right now. If closing your eyes helps, do so. Let us all take 3 deep breaths so we can all be here and be present for this important discussion. Be present with all your emotions and all your thoughts. Set a personal intention of how you want to be present for this discussion. In the chat box at this time, write 1 word that describes your intention, what that intention will be. Thank you for showing up and being present today. I'll share a few words that people have expressed in the chat box: answerability, change, listen, want to learn, knowledge, action, being heard, mindfulness, educate, accountability, healing, support, transparency. Thank you for sharing those words, and feel free to keep sharing them. Clearly, we have many emotions as we are here for this discussion and conversation. We know that the UMB community is large and diverse, and we are all impacted by how George Floyd was killed in broad daylight under the knee of a police officer for nearly 9 minutes. 9 minutes. He had no regard for his life. For me, my feelings are anger, outrage, shock, horror, frustration, disgust, and grief. You may see your brother, uncle, or son in George's eyes as you witness his life being taken away. You may be newly awakened to the reality of police brutality. You may want to do something about it. You may feel helpless or even hopeless. You may be impacted by the demonstrations expressed in our streets and in our nation in all forms. You each have your own lens that you are experiencing from this past week's tragedy and so many other racial injustices. Racism is a grave and ongoing chronic disease in our nation that we are all impacted by. This is not a Black issue. This is an American issue. Structural racism continues to be a problem in our society, and it is reflected in our institutions, including justice, education, housing, health, and sadly, the list continues. When COVID-19 came into our lives, data indicated that Black people were dying disproportionately at higher rates because of the health-related disparities and inequities. This is not a Black issue. This is an American issue. As Americans, we want to believe in respect for human life. We want to believe in dignity for everyone, no matter their race, their economic status, or social standing. There are morals and values that we as Americans want our nation to be proud of. This horrific act of violence and all the many racial injustices that have been our reality for decades must stop. We need structural and systemic changes that create equity. We need institutional and policy changes that prevent such horrific acts against people of color and that does not tolerate abuse, but that promotes common values. At UMB, we must do our part. Today, we will have two panelists that will share their experiences and wisdom from years of working toward a more just society. So this morning, I look forward to listening and learning from our panelists. So what can UMB as an anchor institution and its leadership do to map a path forward for systemic change? We also want to hear from you. Your ideas and thoughts are welcome and encouraged. Action needs to be taken at all levels, within us as individuals, in our families, communities, institutions, and in our nation. Russell McClain will be moderating the session with me this morning. Russell is a law school professor and associate dean for diversity and inclusion at the Carey School of Law. His research looks at the effects of implicit bias and stereotype threat in higher education. He has a forthcoming book called The Guide to Belonging in Law School. Russell is also a permanent member of our President's Diversity Advisory Council. Our two panelists are Drs. Wendy Shaia and Chaz Arnett. Dr. Wendy Shaia, Clinical Associate Professor and Executive Director of the Social Work Community Outreach Service, is a graduate of our University of Maryland School of Social Work. Wendy obtained her Doctor of Education in Human and Organizational Learning from George Washington University. She has 30 years of experience developing, implementing, and leading organizations and programs. Wendy is also the founder of Positive School Center at the University of Maryland School of Social Work. Her work focuses on creating positive school climate and reducing the disproportionate suspensions and expulsions of children of color and children with disabilities from Maryland schools. She also developed the SHARP framework for providing services to people who have experienced poverty and oppression. Chaz Arnett is an associate professor of law at the University of Maryland School of Law, teaching courses in criminal procedure, race and the law, juvenile justice, and education law. Professor Arnett's research interests rest at the intersection of criminal law, technology, and surveillance studies. His most recent scholarship examines the ways in which surveillance measures are used within the criminal justice system and the impact that these practices have on historically marginalized groups and vulnerable population. Prior to teaching, Professor Arnett served as a trial attorney with public defender offices in Baltimore and New Orleans, and as a staff attorney with the Advancement Project, where he assisted in local and national campaigns at combating school-to-prison pipeline. He also worked with the International Center for Transitional Justice on issues of constitutional development in Zimbabwe and asylum cases for the Zimbabwean refugees in South Africa. He has received numerous awards and accolades for his commitment toward furthering human rights through the criminal justice reform. Russell?
Thank you, Dr. Steins. I am a little bit worried that my internet is choppy this morning, but I hope that you all can hear me. I wish that I had something profound to say. I was going to talk about my own experience with me with guns drawn. I've been thinking about this for several days and was fully prepared, but I've just come to realize that my experience was ordinary. I'm fortunate to have emerged from that experience alive. I guess what I would like to discuss briefly is how we are feeling collectively as a community, as a nation. There are many words that come to mind when we think about how we're feeling. Dr. Steins expressed some on one word, and the word that comes to mind for me is terror. I don't know if you have seen the video of Ty Anders. 6 days ago, Mr. Anders, who's a 21-year-old African-American male, was stopped by the police ostensibly for running a stop sign. Rather than stopping right when the lights went on, he drove several blocks, several minutes to his grandmother's home and pulled into her driveway and remained in his car for 6 minutes, terrified. If you see him when he does come out of his car with numerous police officers surrounding him, pointing their guns at him. And it is clear, to me at least, as I watch it, that he knew that if he made the wrong move, that those triggers would be pulled, and that he might die. He was screaming and pleading while the police were trying to get him to walk toward the last thing that he wanted to do. His grandmother walked out of the house with a cane, slowly walking up to try to put herself between him and the police, between him and these guns. At which moment the police decided to swarm, and in the ensuing events, the grandmother falls over on top of her grandson. And to me, like, that is, I think that it crystallizes for me at least how many of us feel to send our children out into the world. We're terrified to send spouses, terrified. We have codes, we have rules that we have to follow. For some people, you get pulled over by the police, and for me, I know I better keep my hands at 10 and 2 locked and not make a move until I'm told to do so. Some of us live in a different world and often experience this world as second-class citizens. we're interested in how you are feeling. And so in a moment, you'll see a few questions that will pop up on your screen that we'd like you to take a few minutes to answer, just so that we can have a sense of how you are doing. And if you would please just take a few minutes to answer these questions. We'll pause for about 3 minutes to give you some time, and then I will introduce Dr. Shaia to give some remarks. So maybe I'll just say a couple of things before we, Dr. Shaia. At UMB, we have a lot of programs and a lot of amazing speakers who come and share their knowledge with us. And because I've been a part of the planning of some of those, I know that those get planned weeks, months, even longer sometimes in advance. This is not that program. We're feeling raw, we're feeling hurt. We're not prepared, right? This is not something that you can prepare to do. So I want you to please bear with us and give yourselves some space to grieve here. We may make mistakes as we work through this as a community. And we're going to do our best today just to begin a conversation, or to continue a conversation about these topics, recognizing that in the time that we have, there's no way we can possibly solve all of these problems. So I will ask Dr. Shaia to, if I can ask you just a question. These are issues, Dr. Shaia, that you teach about, with which you are familiar. You work in these areas, and yet I wonder, how do you proceed in this moment? How do you feel?
So first of all, please call me Wendy. This is a moment for us to break down walls and to reach ourselves through our humanity. So thank you for asking, Russell. I have so many emotions that I don't even know where to start. I feel so much right now. I feel a lot of anger, a lot of grief. I'm having difficulty concentrating, trying to balance, managing, looking at social media or the news and being informed versus being triggered and re-traumatized every time I watch that video. And this is just one of many videos, right? So when I was first asked to participate in this conversation, my first worry was, I'm not going to have all the answers that people want. But then I thought, well, who does? And I also thought, I'm going to be too emotional. I have found myself, probably like many of you, crying several times a day over the last week. And I worried that I would come with all my emotion. But then I realized that was okay, and that I would just show up exactly how I am, because I need this community to heal. But I keep asking myself, how did we get here? And I keep coming back to the idea that this country continues to struggle with the silent, insidious institution of white supremacy. Now, when I say white supremacy, many people are going to imagine hoods or burning crosses, and that is in fact a form of white supremacy. But this institution is so much bigger than that. Legal scholar Frances Lee Ensley defines white supremacy like this. By white supremacy, I do not mean to allude only to the self-conscious racism of white supremacist hate groups. I refer instead to a political, economic, and cultural system in which whites overwhelmingly control power and material resources. Conscious and unconscious ideas of white superiority and entitlement are widespread, and relations of white dominance, does that word sound familiar to you right now? White dominance and non-white subordination are daily reenacted across a broad array of institutions and social settings. Dr. Martin Luther King also talked about white supremacy. He said, the doctrine of white supremacy was embedded in every textbook and preached in practically every pulpit. It became a structural part of the culture. And as we can now see, captured on cell phones and street cameras, and that even the most violent forms of white supremacy continue to this day. Any one of us socialized into this society, or a society colonized by Europeans, has been socialized into a culture of white supremacy, regardless of race. And it impacts the way we see the world and the way we show up. I see white supremacist thinking pop up in my own mind all the time. And it is my lifelong journey to eradicate that from my life. So why is this important to the current conversation? Because the police officers who were able to shoot a sleeping woman or kneel on a man's neck they were raised by someone. They were taught by someone. They were loved by someone. They were befriended by someone. They were simply acting out what this society has taught them to do. And that is what's being caught on camera. That's just the tip of the iceberg. There's so much more that we are not seeing every day. So if we want to make real change, not just surface change, but real change, it is this institution that we must address. If we fear talking about white supremacy, if we avoid it for politeness' sake, we are complicit in giving it life. We are each either actively working to dismantle white supremacy, or by our silence and inaction, we are upholding it. There is no middle ground. And if we fail to dismantle white supremacy, we will find ourselves in 50 years protesting and marching about the same issues that we've been marching about this week, which are in fact the same issues we were marching about 50 years ago. So something has to change in each of us. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Wendy. I think we might be able to put the poll results on the screen, and so that everybody can kind of see how the group is feeling. And just while you kind of glance at those data, let me turn to Chaz Arnett, Professor Arnett. I'll ask you the same question. These are issues with which you're familiar, not just from life experience, right, but from your professional journey. And I wonder, how are you taking this all in? How is this landing on you?
Thank you, Russell. I'm hurt, right? And I think of what James Baldwin stated about to be Black, in this country as being in a constant state of rage. And I'm hurt, I'm enraged. The last few months have been sobering. I think about COVID-19 and the disparities there. It just seems like it's a constant onslaught, constant reminder. And right now it's particularly excruciating when you reflect on your own personal vulnerability, your community's vulnerability. It's a lot to process. One of the things that I obsess about is the realization that I've never felt the full extent of humanness, of the full extent of humanity, what full life means, right? Not every day having to worry about the harm that could come to me from fully expressing myself or fully expressing all parts of me. Not to be presumed incompetent despite all that I accomplish. Not to be assumed as a threat, as a danger, assumed as a criminal. Not to be pulled over and have officers with hands on guns, guns unholstered, guns pointed at me. I'm in my 30s, right? And I've realized not that I have not experienced full life, but that I never will. And that generations after me never will either. that is a heck of a thing to know and to just wrestle with. Quite frankly, it's maddening. So that's where I'm at. I shift and shuffle between hurt and being enraged and nearly losing, losing it on a daily basis.
Thank you, Chaz. Just for those of you who are participating in the chat, and maybe for those of you who aren't, Dr. Steins and I are going to try to curate some of the comments, and if you wish to post some questions, we will try to present them, so please feel free to participate. We have some questions that we will ask, but this isn't about us. This is not about us individually, it's about us as a community. So we hope that you continue to post in the chat so that we can advance some of those questions to the panel. I'll hand it over to Dr. Steins.
Thank you, both Wendy and Chaz. And, Chaz, your remarks, I was, having conversations with my family, and we were reflecting on how we have to watch everything that we do. We can't go out, or Black men can't go out with a hoodie on without thinking about, how am I going to be looked at? Whereas a white person can go out and put whatever they want on and walk whatever way they want without being looked at or people just making assumptions. And it's sad that we can't, as you say, never experience a full life. So I appreciate your words. I appreciate your words too, Wendy. So first question that we have is that some people may see that this type of incident as one bad apple or one cop gone wrong, and others recognize it as another example of rampant racial injustice that's been going on for decades. What are your thoughts about that?
Wendy, you want to go first? Is that to the? I can go. Just the other day, I saw this really interesting social media post by a guy, and he was responding to someone who was making a statement about national protests across the nation and worldwide too were essentially about looting. It was something along those lines, and this guy was responding, and the statement, I can't remember it word for word, but it was along the lines of, if one looter or a few looters undermines this protest movement for you, what do you think about one or a few officers executing people, right? Does that undermine law enforcement as well, right? Do you keep that that same line of perspective? And he, of course, he's being sarcastic, but I think it hit a particular note about what we're thinking and how we're understanding what's happening here. And to be clear, state violence against Black bodies is systematic. Right? And we have to understand that this violence, this constant violence, is connected to a long history of developing institutions, structures, and strategies aimed at surveilling, controlling, and when deemed necessary, destroying Black bodies. And why? Right? And the question is why? Why do we have these institutions? Why do we have these strategies? Why do we have these practices? And that is because this country was built upon racial capitalism. The people at the bottom are exploited. And some of the more poignant commentators that have been writing pieces in this moment have referred to racial subordination and exploitation as the true looting, right? The literal looting. economically, and in the cases of George Floyd, death, looting of the body, quite literally. And in this hierarchy, those who are at the bottom is determined by race. I mean, you can look at that in every category, right? Blacks are given higher mortgage interest rates, right? They pay more for housing, even though the housing is devalued. You see that across Baltimore, right? Look at banking fees, higher banking fees. We pay more for college loans. We're paid at fractions of the salaries of white professionals, right? Even when they have less credentials. So you take all of these things in mind, and you understand that there's real material benefits that come from enacting and protecting this racial capitalist structure that we have in this country. So policing is a part of maintaining that imbalance status quo. You think about George Floyd and Eric Garner, both people who had literally had their lives choked out of them, and what they were accused of, right? Eric Garner was accused of selling individual cigarettes outside of a store. And now with George Floyd, I believe the allegations are that he was attempting to use a fake bill in the store, right? And the hammer comes down for these incidents. So the systematic policing that we see is a part of maintaining this racial hierarchy. And I think Elsie put it clearly in her initial remarks. This structure is not something that just hurts and harms Black people. It harms all of us. It's holding all of us back. We're all invested in dismantling these systems. So when we think about policing, we shouldn't think about just individuals, right? These individual officers should be prosecuted, should be held accountable, but understand that this is a part of a larger systematic subordination of Black people in this country. And it's connected to class hierarchy as well. So we can't deal with class issues and the great wealth inequality in this country without addressing issues of racism as well.
Can I just say?
Absolutely.
So again, I'm hoping that you can hear me. There are a number of comments in the chat, and it's hard to necessarily go in order to try to segue from one comment to the next. But several people seem to be commenting on the fact that we're caught in a web of white supremacy, right? Of which this George Floyd experience is just one, right? We see, killings, but we also see inequities in a range of other areas. And several people have asked a version of the question: how do we confront these structures of supremacy, even within our own university, even within our own workplaces? Do you all have thoughts?
So could you repeat that?
Sure. The question really is, how do we confront the structures of supremacy within our own university, within our own workplaces, and acknowledge, right, those structures that exist within our own community?
Well, I'll start, and then maybe leadership might have some more to say. I think one of the first things that we have to do, and people have been typing this in the chat, is that we have to acknowledge our history. Any country, city, institution that does not recognize its history is destined to repeat it and repeat it and repeat it, and just change the name for the same thing. We'll call it something different. And so I think for our institution, we're no different. We have to understand that even that our institution's history is inextricably tied to Baltimore's history. And Baltimore's history, Baltimore led the nation in racial profiling, right? We're ground zero for that. We showed the rest of the country how to separate people by race, how to hold people down. It is unreasonable to think that our institution, sitting in the middle of that history, was not impacted by it. And so part of our job, I believe, is to be able to speak it. The first thing we've got to do is identify the issues. We've got to hear them from people who work at UMB. We've got to identify how our history has shaped us. And we need to define for ourselves what we want our future to be based on where we've come from. When we don't do that, we sort of go along in the same sort of way, and we kind of can ignore a lot of what is happening as far as white supremacy is going in our own institution, in our own city. And so knowing your history is so important, because we've got to be able to go backwards before we can go forwards.
Thank you. Dr. Steins, do you have a question?
No, I can, you want me to ask the next question?
Oh, yeah, please.
What would you say are the social constructs that may lead to these deaths? There are a lot of things out there that can contribute. You know, sometimes I think about the social determinants of health, where you live, where you play, where you learn, where you worship, contribute. What are your thoughts?
I can chime in on that, and particularly from my vantage point as a lawyer and law professor. But I'll say briefly for those who may not have any idea who I am in terms of this university community. I'm just beginning at the law school as of July 1. So this is how much I care about this community. I haven't even received a check yet, and I'm here. But to the extent of before I talk about the social constructs, I mean, as a university, as a community, I think we have to be mindful of the ways that University of Maryland has benefit and reaped material well-being from these systems as well. I mean, you think about the law school. The law school has Thurgood Marshall's name on it, and he was denied being able to attend University of Maryland, right? So it's a long history there. You know, in the city, as Wendy noted, we have to understand the ways that as a university we have played into it, not only historically but currently. What are the current ways in which the university community is benefiting and reaping unjust benefits connected to racial capitalism? We should know that. We produce hundreds of professionals that are going out and doing work in medicine and in law and other fields, business, et cetera. What are we saying that these students must know, must understand, must commit to before we offer them a degree, right? So these are things that we should be thinking about as a university community, and I look forward and being part of those conversations when I touch ground in Baltimore and I'm here via Pittsburgh. But to the question about social constructs, again, as from my vantage point, I have to be clear that one of the most powerful social constructs that plays into it or leads up to these public executions of Black people is law, and not just law on the books, but also legal institutions and practices and legal strategies and legal realities in our so-called justice system. And if you think about it, in an ideal legal system, you would not see someone defenseless and handcuffed, murdered on video by law enforcement, and it take worldwide protests just to get an indictment. You would not see that in a just legal system, right? That is a fundamental indicator that our legal systems operate differently depending upon who you are. And that is antithetical to democracy. That is a mockery of these ideals of freedom and liberty and justice as well. I teach criminal procedure and criminal law courses. Fourth Amendment jurisprudence, Fourth Amendment, which is developed with this idea that we should have a certain level of protection and privacy against the state. However, Fourth Amendment jurisprudence has paved the way in tacit ways and explicit ways for racialized policing, right? Fourth Amendment jurisprudence allows that. Right, and I could talk to you about the cases doled out from the Supreme Court that lays that groundwork for what we see in terms of racial profile. You think about also under the Fourth Amendment in terms of bringing civil actions when victims are subjected to excessive force from law enforcement, or the victim's family after they are killed are attempting to at least, at the very least, reap material compensation or some form of reparation for the taking of that life. There are barriers erected in the Fourth Amendment jurisprudence in terms of qualified immunity, right? Stopping the extent to which individual officers must be held accountable financially. So we see these legal institutions play this role in paving the pathway. And I think about the law as not only a conspirator, but an accomplice in what we see here in killing and executing Black people without any sort of accountability.
Good.
Thank you. So I think that we may have a comment from Courtney Jones Carney, a comment or a question while we're waiting for perhaps for her to be her mic to be opened. I'll just say we've had a lot of questions from those in the chat who are, I think they would regard themselves as white allies and are asking, what can they do? So maybe we'll ask that question if Courtney is mic'd and ready to go. We can ask that question.
Courtney's there. Go ahead, Courtney. Courtney, you can speak up.
No, you cannot hear me.
We can hear you now.
Can't hear you. Yes. Go ahead, Courtney.
All right. Thank you for giving me this opportunity to speak. I want to thank the panelists for making yourself so vulnerable in this point and, possibly opening up yourself to some harm in this conversation. And with that, I want to talk a little bit about the responsibility of individuals who are white to do this work. And so earlier in the conversation when Dr. Jarrell introduced folks, he said he didn't have the answer. And then he introduced the panelists. And so I want to talk a bit about putting the responsibility, this emotional and physical labor on Black and brown people, and the fact that we are consistently doing that, which is steeped in white supremacy. And so what do we do to shift that focus and make it clear that this is mainly the responsibility of white individuals to combat white supremacy and structural inequities, and what can leaders at UMB do specifically in that realm?
So
thank you.
So maybe I can just start, and then I hope our panelists will join in. We struggled greatly as we thought about how to put this panel together, and I think we felt that there was no perfect way to do this, right? On the one hand, I think you rightly point out that this isn't our problem to solve. In fact, because we are disempowered, there are ways in which without white allies and without those who are in positions of power to make a difference, that we may not be able to affect the change that needs to be made. And so not having a white panelist or having another person, an ally on the panel could be problematic. We also worried that this is so raw and this is such a concern for us as a Black community, that this, because this is such a hurtful moment, that this may not be the time for others to have the first opportunity to have a voice in this matter. I'm not at all sure we made the right decision, but at least I wanted to be transparent about our thinking. I absolutely agree that this is not something where we can just continue to have Black voices speaking to a problem of white supremacy. And I genuinely hope that our community will find ways to continue to have conversations in a meaningful way, and not just talking about it, that we can really find ways to implement change in our own university, in our own community. Panelists, do you have some thoughts on that?
I have some thoughts, but I'm still a Black person talking about what white people should do, which is still part of the problem of the question Courtney's asking, right? So I will say I'm tired. I'm worn out. I was watching the chat and somebody was talking about the Black tax. There is a tax that you carry if you are Black in this institution to help solve the problems of whiteness. And it's exhausting. It is so tiring. And not only is it exhausting, it is traumatizing to have to do this over and over again. I do have a few thoughts about what white people can do. Well, first of all, stop asking Black people what you should do. I really think it is very much like coming up to somebody who is in the middle of an intense crisis and asking them something about your personal life. I believe strongly in the power of white ally groups working with accountability from Black and brown people to help solve these problems. But I think the first thing white people need to do is ask themselves how they benefit from white supremacy. Let's be very real here, because I think there is a lot of rose-colored glasses about the fact that white supremacy is happening off somewhere here, right? But there are lots of ways that white people benefit. And the first step is to figure that out. And then the next step is to figure out how white supremacy hurts you, because white supremacy hurts every single human being. And one of the ways it hurts us is by denying all of us the opportunity to operate at our full potential. We have no idea what this society would be like if a huge number of Black people weren't sitting in prison, or if the school to prison pipeline was eradicated and every child of color had the opportunity to gain the full education and be everything they could be. We have no idea what this society could be like. In fact, I think it is one of the things that is holding America back, because we're only working with full potential from a small number of people. Go learn your history. Understand your own history as white people, because there have always been white people. Somebody reminded me of this week, and I am so grateful for that conversation. There have been white people throughout the history of this country who have been amazing allies, who have fought for Black and brown people. And there are lots of lessons to learn from white allies who are white people who are fighting injustice that didn't have anything to do with people of color. But there are still lessons to learn there. Go to your ancestry, go to your ancestors and understand how people have fought before, and go and take those lessons. You don't need to come to us and ask. Go find them. They exist. Recognize that helping people, we're a helping university. Recognize that helping people maintains the hierarchy of white supremacy. We are constantly in our social work and our medical and all of our service ways, thinking that we should go out and help. We could go create some new programs for these Black and brown people without understanding that that maintains a structure where they are on the bottom and other people are on the top. Instead, focus your attention on working with Black and brown people to find their own power, to access their own liberation. And that's not going to come in the form of a handout. I'm going to give you a little bit of this service here. I'm going to give you a little bit of this financial incentive here. But at the end of the day, the benefit to them is very small, because we have been creating new programs for the last half a century, and people are more poor and oppressed now than they ever were. So clearly that is not the answer. We like to focus on exceptionalism. We'll pull somebody out here and we'll say, look at this person and how well they've done. And we'll pull somebody out here and we'll say, we provided this service to this person, so we're doing a great job. But if you look across society, you look across our city, we continue to people exist in abject poverty. So clearly that is not the answer. That is just a reincarnation of white supremacy, and we call it service provision. I'm not saying people don't need services, but I am saying that in your medical profession, when somebody comes to you with COVID, it is a good time to have a conversation with them about the disparities that Black and brown people are experiencing. And why is that? And help them think through the reality of what is actually impacting their lives. In social work, when somebody comes to us for a service, we can provide that service without ever talking about the root causes of what they're experiencing. I had a conversation with a woman the other day who, a Black woman who was a part of our community who almost lost a baby when she almost died when she was in childbirth. And so we had this whole conversation about Black woman maternal death rate. And she had never heard that before. She was carrying all this shame and all of this, I must have done something wrong. And I kept thinking, okay, but her doctor never said to her, this is a problem for Black women. It wasn't something you did wrong. And here's how you can advocate for yourself. There are so many things we can do, but we continue to think that we're helping. We're maintaining the status quo.
I will jump in and just say the statement and question raised by Courtney. Thank you for raising that, and your bravery in doing so. I think about this a lot, and the burden that's placed on Black community, Black individuals in these moments. And, there has to be significant effort and motivation by non-Black and brown folks to engage in this work and do this work and come off of the sidelines in this, because the injustices that we are experiencing is connected to larger injustices in this society and in America generally. I mean, racist infrastructure, racism, structural racism is quite literally the proverbial knee on our necks, right? And if we don't realize that, we'll continue to not be able to breathe. But I think about myself, right? Like if in a more ideal world, what would I be doing, right? I'd be a poet, I'd be an actor, I'd be doing something else. But besides dedicating my life to doing work in the criminal justice system. But being what it is, I owe it to my family in Baltimore. I owe it to my ancestors who were enslaved on the Eastern Shore of Maryland, right? I can't shy away from this work, given what they sacrificed. So I have to be a part of this conversation as taxing as it is, because I have so much invested. Literally, my body. My body is invested. So it's a lot. But in terms of coming off of those sidelines and things that can be done, people are putting out a lot of work out there, how to be more involved. Those who are concerned about what's happening in the criminal justice system, how engaged are you locally? Do you understand what happens in your local criminal justice system? Have you been to court? Do you know who the prosecutors are? Do you know what the policies are? Or do you monitor what's happening in your police departments, right? And the potential transformations that need to take place. And I'm not talking about reshuffling and bringing in a police commissioner from Oakland or a police commissioner from New Orleans or a police commissioner from New York, but I mean fundamentally changing policing. Like if we were seriously committed, and I think a majority of people will say, at least locally, that we have deep problems with policing. And if we were truly committed to that as a majority, we can change what policing is, right? And be clear that changing what policing is, how we do policing, who the police are, if we need police, to change that, we have to change so many other things that we do. We have to change education. We have to change housing. We have to change medicine. We have to change the economy and labor and those things, but they can be done. And it's not something that we'll be able to do by ourselves. Current research project that I'm working on now has led me to reading a number of slave narratives in Maryland, and what I'm learning from reading through those narratives of slaves in Maryland, particularly those who participated in the Underground Railroad, was the extent to which they sacrificed to resist the structures that were being imposed on them. And also one of the most compelling things about those narratives as well is the risks and sacrifices that were made by white people on the Underground Railroad to assist.
That's right.
So, I mean, we have to be in this together. And if we aren't going to be able to dismantle these systems and structures to the degree that we need to.
Thanks very much, both of you. I think we have a question from Stephen Ragsdale, or a question or a comment from Mr. Ragsdale.
Let me turn my radio down. I'm sorry. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. My question is, what's the role of education to better understand and to teach a better history around how these systems were inculcated, how they were developed? I'm thinking of Ibram Kendi's book, Stamped from the Beginning. You know, we live a certain way today because these systems were designed to be simultaneous and overlapping forms of inequality from the start, and they have been concretized over time. How do we get to a point where education is teaching a much better brand of American history? And I'll put myself on mute and wait for a response.
Can I just start with that? So, you know, in our Positive School Center, I do a lot of workshops in Baltimore City schools. And I talk about, I have a workshop we do called How to Be an Anti-Racist Educator. And, you know, so I'm teaching the whole school faculty and staff. And I usually show them a 1937 redlining map, and I go through, you know, Baltimore's history. And I always ask the teachers, how many of you were familiar with this history? And I will tell you that we only get a few hands raised. So it's not possible for educators to educate children with material that they don't know. And so I think we need to go back to our institutions of higher learning as well, right? Because in any profession, that you are, where you are involved with the public, I think history is an important part of that. And understanding particularly the history of people who have been systematically marginalized is really important. But we're not teaching our teachers the history of systemic oppression, so they can't help our kids learn. There is a very small number that I have come across who really are conversant in history, even history teachers. And let me just say, remember Martin Luther King said that our history books are absolutely inculcated with white supremacy. There is so much that our history books leave out, and it's very slanted to a particular viewpoint. So you're right, Stephen, it's overlapping intricate systems that we have to address. And that's one of the problems about why the institution of white supremacy is so insidious, because how do you address all of those systems at one time? I don't necessarily have an answer for you, but I do know that there are multiple systems that have to be addressed in order to get to the point where teachers are teaching young people this kind of history.
You know, I think as we have I agree with everything that you said, Wendy, but I think as we have our students come to Baltimore from all different places, I think that our institution should make it a requirement, a class, so our students understand the history of Baltimore. There is so much to learn, and you can't just expect students to go out and work in our community and not understand that history. And so I think that having a mandatory requirement for all our students that first year of coming in, so they can understand our history, they can understand Baltimore's history, because you can't expect our students to go in and be able to provide care, to have clients in our from Baltimore and expect them to understand. And so you have to start with them coming in that first year. You know, there should be a mandatory class, whether it's the summer before they start. But it's not fair to the students for you to put them out in the community to go take care of these families and not really understand that history, because they're not going to be successful and they're not going to understand. So, you know, that's my thought. But I think that's something that we should really consider going forward.
Thank you. So there are a number of comments in the chat and questions in the chat that are really geared towards and directed to the administration. So I think maybe this is an opportunity to put Dr. Jarrell on the spot and ask what, you know, maybe a tough question, and maybe a tough question to hear or a tough question to answer. But there are comments in the chat that are asking, you know, about kind of structural problems within our university. I've seen a number of comments about the furniture that we sit on being made by incarcerated people. There's some concerns about the diversity within staff and faculty, including tenure-track faculty. And so I don't expect this is the moment, Dr. Jarrell, where you can answer all those questions directly, but I do wonder if you have some thoughts for us about what the university can do to address what may be, you know, kind of intransigent structural problems even within our own university.
Thank you, Russell, and I'll do my best on this. I hope that all of you understand that it wasn't the easiest thing for me to have this town hall. And in fact, when I first heard about the death of Mr. Floyd, I immediately wanted to have a town hall because I thought there were important issues to discuss and for me to hear about. I will tell you that at least some advice that I received was, you shouldn't do that. We've been there, we've done that. People are tired about just talk. Wendy, you make me think of that expression entirely. People are tired of just talk. That action doesn't result from these discussions, that it'll be a hollow discussion. What's the gain? And I don't know the answer to all of those things, but I thought it was extremely important to have a conversation, as uncomfortable and as perhaps disjointed, or those kinds of words that you could apply to this might be, because in the end, to me, this starts with conversation and understanding. And I was happy to hear that Stephen Ragsdale was on the call. Hi, Stephen, because I have heard Stephen lecture to understand about the structural racism. And Wendy, I did learn last year about the red lighting districts because I thought it was extremely important, as did President Perman and Roger Ward and those before me, that we should learn about this, because the first step for me, at least, and I'll speak for myself, was to become educated on these things, which I did not know about, and which I've learned. So I think my first response to the community at large and how I would approach this is, there's a lot to learn, and that doesn't mean that there's not an urgency. Yes, there's bleeding going on, if I may use my own surgeon word, but there's also a need to act wisely and to act in an educated fashion. And so I think that would be the first thing that I would comment on. And Elsie, you and others have talked about, should we have an orientation class for all of our students? I think my answer on that is yes. I don't know exactly how to do that, since we have schools that are steeped in accreditation requirements, but I think that would be a very important first step to take place here. So I am very much in favor of that, and we will push for that. And Wendy, I go back to your school. If there's anything I've learned from the social work students, it's that you have to learn about structural racism in order to understand what's going on in Baltimore and the like. And I think our entire university needs to understand these things as well, because it is part of our fabric. And I think it's easy for people to say, well, you white people have to fix this. Wait a minute, I don't know how to do that. And I may be as committed as I could be to doing that, but I need wise advice. I need people like the DAC and people like this panel saying, you know, have you thought about this? Have you considered that? This is an example of what we're talking about, because I live in my own world too, just like you, and I have to understand what's going on around me. So I do believe that this conversation has been valuable to me to start with. I think what I've learned is that I need to hear directly from people. I don't need broad ideas. I need people directly telling me what they're thinking, because my style is about bringing people together. It's not about pushing them apart. It's about using civil language. Quite frankly, the UMB, the whole idea of our mission and vision and principles is that we need to be civil. We need to do it in a way that we don't marginalize, but also not polarize different people. We need to have different points of view, but we need to allow it to not impede the conversation. And we need places to have these conversations. So here's one example of that. And if this is a one and done, then I will have failed. So this can't be a one and done. And I do need your participation. So what are the kinds of things that I think we should be doing? Well, first of all, we do have 7 very great schools, and 2 of them are represented here in the School of Law and the School of Social Work. And of course, Elsie, I didn't forget about you in the School of Nursing. But I think what Chaz said earlier was extremely important to me about knowing how to change policy and get things done. I also think that it's part of the education of every student that comes out of here. And although I can mandate or maybe I can mandate, I'm not even sure of that, a curriculum that gets all of the incoming students. The schools have to embrace that, and they have to embrace it not just as a course when I walk in the door and then see you later, but by their very actions and how they interact with people and all of these types of things. So to me, it's not just some kind of orientation. It's an ongoing sensitization to these issues and helping us to understand it. The other thing that I know that DAC got the benefit of several weeks ago is we had Dr. Damon Williams come and talk, and some of you may know Dr. Williams. He's a national expert on addressing race relations within universities and other institutions. And he had a very good suggestion, which I have taken up and I have put in my thought process at this point in time, and that is he was talking about the effect of COVID, and I don't know about all of you, but I have been living and breathing COVID every day of the week for very long hours. And the point he made was, you know, it's so easy to make all these decisions about what are we going to do about COVID, et cetera, and then who's thinking about what are the consequences of these decisions relative to the disadvantaged or other people. So the diversity, equity, and inclusion principle that we have in our core values. And so his suggestion, which I find very valuable, is that when we start a discussion, particularly where there's a decision at the end of the line about, oh, the university is going to do this or start that or support this, part of that question ought to be preceded by, and yes, what's going to be the effect on diversity, equity, and inclusion in our institution? So do I have concrete, we're going to do this, this, and this? No, but I certainly think that I have a process in mind which allows me to keep these kinds of concepts in the front of my mind. And COVID is overwhelming right now, and it is clearly affecting different populations in a very adverse manner, and we need to address that as well. The one other thing that I would say is that we have set aside money to improve the diversity, equity, and inclusion part, particularly of our faculty, Russell. I think you mentioned that one. I'm happy to say that we supported people like getting Chaz Arnett here. Chaz, I'm so pleased to welcome you to this campus. And although we hadn't met before, I'm so pleased to hear the perspective that you bring. And I hope I hear more of it, because I think that's how we will change. So thank you for being here and for saying the very difficult things that I know you had to say. I know that was hurtful, but I appreciate that you did. So in the end, my opinion is we start with education, but we start with a commitment at the university level that there are other things we can do in addition to education. And yes, Wendy, I do need your help. I'm sorry to say that, but I don't know the answers. All I know is that if we're determined enough to execute them, we will come to good results. So that's my commitment at this point in this discussion. Alex, are there any other questions that you had for me specifically, since that was a me question?
But I also wanted to just make one more comment, and just seeing, you know, some of the comments in the chat. So, you know, I had mentioned that, you know, it's important for us to educate our students before coming in, and people have written in the chat about not only the students, but also our faculty and staff. And so, you know, if we don't educate the faculty and staff as they are coming in or onboarded, and even the people who have been at UMB for years and years, those people need to go through the training too. All people. You know, when I first came from, you know, I worked in Fairfax and I lived in Washington, D.C. And although Washington is very close to Baltimore, I didn't know Baltimore's history. You know, I learned that as time went on, and I still continue to learn. There are things that, you know, when Stephen Ragsdale came as our diversity speaker, there was so much that I learned in just that hour and a half that he shared with us. And so I know that we can't cover it all in an orientation or over a period of time. It's going to be an ongoing process, but I think as you hire new faculty and staff, and including the staff that are already here, that there has to be some type of training, education about Baltimore, about the history. And so, I was wrong to say students, because if we educate the students and our faculty and staff don't know that, then what's the point? So
Yeah, I think that's exactly right, Elsie, and I agree with that. And it was eye-opener for our group that was in the room hearing about all of this.
So we have 6 minutes, and just on that last point, I guess I would want to just say one additional thing. I do think that we should think beyond programs and trainings and really think about how to infuse change into our curricula, that it can't be a one town hall or one diversity speaker, one hire, but that we really need to think more globally and holistically about the ways that we can affect change in our community, in our university. I also would like to say I'm aware that a number of you have asked to ask questions in the chat, and I'm sorry that we haven't been able to get to all of you. And so I'm just sorry that we can't get to it all. We did want to kind of end with a question to our panelists. I think among the things people are feeling right now is helplessness. If we look at our poll results, over half of the people or roughly half of the people who responded said helplessness was that they're feeling right now, along with grief and anger. And I think this is a moment where there are strong feelings, there are strong emotions, and a desire for change. And I just thought I might ask the panelists, for those of us who are feeling helpless, who are feeling like, will this never change? Like, how can we channel this energy that we have in some productive way?
I guess I can go first. First, I guess this is be the last thing that we're saying before we log off. So thank you all for pulling this together. Thank you all. It's been a flurry of comments and questions in the chat group. That's been good to see. I think people are raising amazing points. It's my understanding that we can save or copy and paste what's in the chat group. So these are questions that I think the university can think through moving forward, even if we can't address them right now. For those who are feeling helpless, and I swing through different feelings. Helplessness is one of them. What has been heartening to see in those moments of feeling helpless is the wide range of hues that I see at these protests across the country. Young folks from all different backgrounds are coming out to express rage at what's happening. Also seeing protest movements across the globe. I mean, there were protests in places like Brazil and Nigeria, people holding up Black Lives Matter signs in Berlin and in the UK and all these other countries. I mean, Hong Kong protesters are standing in unity, saying Black Lives Matter and say his name, say George Floyd's name. My brother lives in Japan. They have protests there in Tokyo. So it's when I see that, that's profound to me on so many levels. So it gives me a sense of hope, even when I'm at my deepest despair points, in terms of helplessness. I think there is something there. And part of what we have to do, in addition to all the things that have been suggested in terms of what we can do as a UMB community, in terms of curriculum, in terms of programming, in terms of classes, not only at the beginning before people begin, but throughout their matriculation here in this community. I think one of the things that we do, we have brain power, we have resources as a community. We need to be putting out counter narratives. One of the things that distresses me most is in these moments, you think about a city like Baltimore, high murder rate. How can you protest an officer killing a Black man when Black men are killed, so often and frequently? In Baltimore, there's these red herring narratives out there, right? And if you think about that, you have to think about the connection between the two, right? If you are constantly seeing and being shown that your life does not matter, in policing, in education, in the labor market, when you go into a court, when you go into stores and being monitored and followed, when you have a spy plane over top of you watching your every move, you are being shown and told that you do not matter, that your life does not matter. And then at some point, people buy into that and they believe it and they act accordingly. So to create some distinction between murder rates in cities and police officer killings is a farce. So I think we have to be on the front of pushing those counter narratives and explaining what's happening. And we have the scholars, we have the resources, we have the faculty here to be able to do so. So for those, you're in my thoughts, for those who are feeling helpless, but I think there are things that we can begin doing to empower ourselves when we move from those moments of helplessness.
I will be very quick. I would say organize, organize, organize. Get together with people who are like you and have tough conversations. And every time you sit down with somebody who says something that shows that they don't have an understanding of how white supremacy is showing up, help them understand. If this is going to be work that is done person to person and on a systemic level. Find your policymakers. Make sure that you put people in place who are going to work to dismantle racism and white supremacy. That's the job for each one of us. Learn your history. Go find your ancestors and how they struggled. And that doesn't mean just in your family line. That just means people who've walked this road before us, and figure out how we can walk in their steps also. And the final thing I would say is take care of yourselves and each other, because this work is hard and it will take you out of this world. I know that from personal experience. So find a way to care for yourself and care for each other as we're doing this work, because we have to make it to the other side.
So I think that concludes our session. I want to thank Wendy and Chaz for doing this on short notice, and I certainly want to thank Russell and Elsie for hosting this as well. We will be back at this. I thank you, and we'll be seeing you in the next one. So we'll see you. Goodbye.